Well, hello and good morning, and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and today I'll be talking with Stuart Parker about the Kamloops residential school situation, indeed the residential school situation throughout Canada and the long storied history of said system. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, and take out a subscription at the Standard if you would like to continue supporting the free voice of the West. Before we get going to my opening statement here, we've got our Resistance Coffee Company endorsement that we need to start off with, and I'm so glad to have them as a sponsor for the show and for the Western Standard. And here we go. Are you tired of having woke political correctness rammed down your throat everywhere you turn? Are you frustrated by businesses you support giving money to woke causes? Well, Resistance Coffee Company is here for you. Now you can enjoy the wonderful taste of fresh roasted coffee with the knowledge that your money isn't funding the woke causes you despise. In fact, Resistant Coffee gives 10% of every purchase to organizations that are fighting for the constitutional freedoms of Canadians. You can visit resistancecoffee.com, that's resistancecoffee.com, and use the promo code Western Standard, all one word, all lowercase, for 10% off your first order. And that's, of course, online, and they are actually based out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I was getting that wrong the last 2 days. I want to apologize to the Resistance Coffee Company. It's Weyburn, Saskatchewan, I believe, is where they are. All right, so we're going to get on to the opening statement. We'll do another endorsement probably near the end of the show or at the midway point. And the opening statement for today is pretty straightforward. We'll be touching on a few different news items this morning. And of course, when Stuart comes on later, we'll discuss the Kamloops residential school incident that has still got all of us reeling. There's still a lot of shock and awe around, and for that matter, anger around the country. But if I might be allowed to weigh into this question one last time as the token Indian, I don't know if I'm the only guy who has a status card at the Standard, but I'm definitely that guy, at least right here, right now. And I do have some things to say on this point. And I would like to say, yes, the residential school issue bothers me, but no, don't destroy our history in the pursuit of justice, or however you want to call it, equity or reconciliation or recompense, reparation. So discarding Sir John A's statue is not going to bring back any children who ever died at residential school, either through neglect or disease or abuse. Indeed, Sir John A. was not even Prime Minister when the Indian Act was passed. The drunk who founded this country, that is how I prefer to remember him, was a man of many vices and a parliamentary genius. But he was actually a rather progressive mind for his time. If you look at what John A. was trying to do in his era, Sir John A. was not anyone's idea of a racist individual. He carried opinions of his time. It's true, opinions that would not stand the test of time today. But nonetheless, Sir John A. One, of course, conceived a country the size of, 2/3 the size of Russia, 1.5 times the United States, with nobody in it. To build a railway across it, to combine two different cultures, the French and the English, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant, on top of course, the various indigenous. I never liked the word indigenous. I prefer the word Indian or Aboriginal myself, but nonetheless, various cultures across Canada, on top of the white ethnics that were then being, shuttled into the prairies after the railroad was complete. And he really did build a nation from coast to coast to coast. That's impressive. And he did it, honestly, without the kind of bloodshed that most empires are made of. It's a fact. That doesn't mean there was no bloodshed. But if you want to go pound for pound, toe for toe with all the other empires that were doing what they were doing at the time, Canada's legacy in that moment is not nearly what others were in that same moment, and not long after. So we need to be honest about that. Getting rid of John A. isn't going to change anything about that, and it's not going to bring anybody back. Making it impossible to talk about residential schools dispassionately, even positively, as some of the senior Aboriginal leadership does behind closed doors. And this is true. There are people who are currently leaders today. I mean, the last school closed in 96. So rounding back to 2020, that would make you, unless you were a newborn being carried through the school, it's impossible to be a young adult today and have gone to residential school. It's hard to even be a kind of mid-aged adult and have gone to residential school. You would have to, of course, be a quite mature adult into now almost senior and elder to have gone to residential school. And even amongst those circles, for all the scars there are, and this is not discounting any of the terrible things that did occur, the fact of the matter is that there are those in Aboriginal leadership positions, let alone other positions, that do confess that had they not been put through the rigor of a curriculum that stayed quite traditional well into the 20th century, late 20th century, when other curriculums were beginning to go broke and get woke, because it was usually a Catholic or Christian curriculum, or at least being run by them, they were ensuring that a more liberal arts sort of approach was kept. I'm guessing that grammar and rhetoric and Latin weren't being struck out of the residential school system as quickly as they were in other ones. And further to that point, again, because of the kind of people who were running it, it was rigorous, unlike the kind of soft shoe that we're doing nowadays at a lot of public schools. So that needs to be counted. And the discipline that ensued there, again, not saying that that was okay, and not saying that when it became abusive, that was okay. Even so, the issue at hand is that we have to remember that it formed people, not unlike basic training forms people, not unlike, well, quite frankly, speaking of having the church teach you, if you go and live in seminary, minor seminary down south here for the 5 years of your adolescent life, of your high school career, it forms you getting up at 5 a.m. and going to church. It forms you having only certain times for recreation. It forms you not having constant access to the internet. Of course, that was different back then, but you get what I'm trying to say. And they are separate from society, that school. And that's how schooling used to be. Indeed, residential schools were based off the old English school model, which was how aristocrats educated their children, sending them away to residential schools. So we need to be clear about that. But we need to talk about that dispassionately. We need to be honest about the things that were positive, that certain people remember. And we have to also remember that there are perfectly legitimate lines of inquiry around the entire Indian Act, including the residential schools, that do not require outrage as their fundamental basis. Outrage is never a good form of investigation, and we need to be careful with that. Very careful. It's very, passionate emotion. Finally, it must be acknowledged that residential schools were actually considered an innovative, even progressive policy prescription for their time. And this is going to be kind of surprising. I mean, a lot of people, I'm sure, are anticipating that when Stuart gets on here, which is going to be around 10 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Mountain, that there's going to be some back and forth. And I think this is probably going to be one of our more controversial shows. But the fact of the matter is that even Stuart's going to actually have some lambasting to do when it comes to the left, because this was a progressive idea. It was an extremely progressive idea. We have to remember that everything today that kind of got sucked up into, say, the problem is really the Nazis. Like, everything comes back to the Nazis. The problem is that the Nazis took a whole bunch of ideas that were actually progressive for their time, but they syncretized it and synthesized it into a right-wing identitarian message. This kind of right-of-center understanding of Germany and the Volk and the history of Germany and the very pagan elements of the Germany, because Hitler, of course, didn't want the Christian elements of Germany. He thought that made them soft, because that's the argument Nietzsche made. We're getting off topic here. The point is, though, that from the people's car, right, Volkswagen, right, from the people's car all the way to the public schooling system that was developed under the Nazis, out into, of course, eugenics, which is, again, a very progressive idea in the late 19th century, and abortion, for that matter, too. Like, those ideas, they get trumped up into these weird kind of racial sort of understandings about the right. But the fact of the matter is that they were progressive ideas. And case in point is, right here, the idea of putting people through school is not actually a very conservative idea, not in most of its elements. And even so, where conservatives do value it, it's usually not as holistic as a lot of this is, depending on where you're counting from. The point is that residential schools were tied up in the same kind of school of thought as a lot of other progressive ideas, the same kind of people that were giving us social engineering, the same kind of people that were giving us Darwinism. Those were progressive ideas of the late 19th century, and we need to be honest about that. So finally, we also need to acknowledge that even if you might not agree with the methods being used around the world, particularly the United States, against Aboriginals were essentially enslavement as well as violence. We have to be clear about that. Again, if you want to use the word indigenous as a kind of term of solidarity between me and anybody else who is colonized, anybody that was here already when some visitors showed up and started running the joint, most of which I'm very thankful for, to be honest with you. The fact of the matter is that just about everywhere else in North America and in Southern America and throughout the rest of what is now called the Third World, through Africa and India and the rest of it, Slavery and violence were kind of the tools of the trade. People were enslaved, people were put to work, people were put into indentured servitude, and there was a great amount of violence visited upon all sorts of populations around the world. Not all the time, not at every instance, not every 5 minutes, but this did occur, and it was more brutal in some places than others. Canada, North America in general, but Canada specifically, did not have that same legacy. Slavery actually occurred between us Aboriginals far more frequently than it did between the colonizers and the Aboriginal population in Canada. And so we need to be honest about that. And so the fact of the matter is that, again, even if you think that the residential schools of Canada took a different approach, a bad one perhaps, it still was less overtly wicked or violent or crushing than these other ones were. So finally, we must allow, or rather, we must not allow our outrage to overrule the facts. Were residential schools bad? The result and the scars that we have today bear out that as a general policy, this was not perhaps the best idea. And in the moments where it did terrible things, the answer is yes, those were bad things. The people, the actors, any of the abuse that occurred when those things happened. And of course, the tragedy of being far away from home, perhaps being, deprogrammed from your home culture into a new culture. But furthermore, the fact that you're far away from home and could suffer from disease and die anonymously, cast into a grave quickly because we had to keep, that people had to keep the disease from spreading. That's awful. That's awful. That is bad. There's no question that's bad. Is what happened in Kamloops tolerable by today's standards? Answer is no, of course not. Of course it isn't. We must understand as best we can who these children are. We must contact their families. We must give people rest, give people peace, let people be laid to rest properly. This is a fundamental thing. This goes back. This is not a reconciliation thing. This is not an Aboriginal versus white thing. We going as far back in white culture, to say it that way, European, Indo-European culture and Western culture, all the way back to the pagan stories of properly burying people. And of course, the story of Antigone, that we all were taught at some point, hopefully by our English lit teacher, that there is a fundamental justice. And fundamental justice says that the dead must be buried. They must be buried properly and laid to rest. They're not to be abused. And so we need to make sure that these bodies go where they belong and that people are laid to rest properly. It's also a corporal act of mercy within the Catholic faith. Burying the dead, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, clothing the naked, and burying the dead is one of them. So finally, considering considering kids in care today, this is really important to me. I think it's really important that we remember this. Considering the kids in care today, a disproportionate amount of whom are Aboriginal, can we please consider using our anger to change things in the lives of people right now, rather than tear down ghosts of the past or swing at ghosts of the past? I think that this is something that really cues up for me pretty strongly, because I am really, I just feel really strongly about the fact that we have kids in care today. And honestly, I don't think the foster system we have today, if you really want to compare the two systems, the foster system, I think, has no candle to hold compared to the residential school system. I'm gonna wax philosophical here. I got to fill a few minutes here before Stuart gets on, if you don't mind. We've got actually a comment here from Emily Stewart. Were the children murdered? The media is making it sound like they were murdered. Was it 215 individual graves found? As far as I know, it's not 215 individual graves. It's actually probably combinations of graves. I do not believe that there was just 215 people in one grave site. I don't think that's correct. Though admittedly, once you have a unmarked grave area, you're going to quite literally not know where the next body goes because you don't have it properly marked, unless that earth was recently disturbed or the same groundskeeper is doing the work. I'm not trying to be cold about that or clinical. I'm just stating as a fact, just like anything in your backyard, if you know where it is, then you know where it is. But if somebody else buys your house, you don't know They don't know what's in your backyard because they weren't there when you did that, whatever it was that you did. Planted this there, moved this there, innovated this, put something in to keep the sod from falling down. They don't know what that is. So we don't know exactly how it's going when it comes to the mass grave question. And is it all in one grave? I think it's unlikely. I think it's more likely that there's multiple graves. Smallpox and TB was also a suggested issue for why this happened. And the problem is that we must remember that child mortality was quite high in the early 20th century, quite high. It was still high. Like, I mean, compared to the 18th century, it was lower, but still child mortality was a real thing. And child mortality is still a thing today. We don't talk about it as much. And of course, ever since abortion became legalized, child mortality has kind of paled by comparison. We care more about child mortality today because we have fewer children. So it's less common that children die, but it's more tragic because not that any soul is replaceable, and we love all of our children equally, and we need to love them as special gifts from God. But the fact of the matter is that people are quite fragile, especially at their youngest stage. And so in days of yore, again, not to put it too clinically or coldly, children could die, and the parents of those children understood that, and they also understood that that's why they had more children. Today we have fewer children because we expect every child that we have to live and not to suffer from some kind of tragedy and suddenly go back to God who made them. And so that's a hard thing to swallow. I understand that can sound quite dark, but this is true. This is very true. And our culture has, in my opinion, unfortunately gone the route of having too few children. And having too few children, the children, it's not that they're overvalued. It's just that the tragedy strikes in a far more sharper way. And for that matter, people can't usually reproduce more children because they usually had the 2 children and then usually sterilize themselves, or 3 children and sterilize themselves. So they don't have the ability to produce more children. And so we've kind of created our own problem there. Not to say that every child isn't precious. Every child is precious. But there was a different cultural understanding of that not that long ago. So I think that we need to be clear here with a couple of things. Is there any connection to the UN declaration regarding, I think that's Indigenous peoples, right? Rights of Indigenous peoples. That's right. My producers give me that. That is trying to be passed. It was passed provincially in BC already. I knew that. My provincial. Well, he is a provincial guy. My producer is trying to remind me of that, but that's true. That already passed in British Columbia. So I guess they're trying to pass it everywhere. It's interesting. I don't think that that's going to help us. Like, I want to be very clear here. Like, I'm a very assimilated Indian. Okay, I am. Like, I was raised by whites. I was raised away from the reserve system. I was raised away from the abuse that usually follows in those steps and in that poverty. My mother was unwed. She was impregnated by somebody who apparently, must have looked pretty Italian, because if I give you my side profile, I mean, I don't look like an Indian in the side profile. My nose is a little bit too Roman for that. So as far as we know, I think what my mother told my parents was that my father was Sicilian. So I have a ship passing in the night for a father. I have a mother that I've never met, my biological mother. And then I have my adopted white parents. I was adopted from birth. And I was raised away from all of the tragedy and trauma that usually surrounds, quite frankly, being an Indian in Canada. Like, it does. It's especially if you're on reserve. And so I know that a lot of people then say I have nothing to say about this stuff. And I would say, well, in response, that's not fair, because one, I feel solidarity with my people. I do believe that my people need to be treated better. I do believe that my people need to be properly cared for, and that whatever is just whatever ought to be done when it comes to the Indian Act and that sort of thing needs to take place. We can't live in this, stuck in this way with the Indian Act and everything else, and with the holding back of the people from themselves, and the Aboriginal leadership that does actually visit all sorts of harm upon its own people. That needs to stop. And I've always been an outspoken advocate for the little guy, the little Indian guy, as it turns out, the little Aboriginal guy as well. So I've been very consistent on this point. I've never been not transparent about the fact I don't pretend to have been, raised in a perfectly Indigenous way, if you want to use that term. I don't pretend to be full of traditional culture and traditional understandings of things. I like bannock as much as the next guy, but we all know bannock came from the Scots, because of course bannock is refined flour, and refined flour did not exist on this continent until the white man came. So I think that the problem is that we have to be honest around what happened, right? We have to be honest about what happened. And when we're looking at the residential school system, it was a very particular solution to a very particular problem. And the fact of the matter remains, you have people walking at the first steps of white people into North America, not counting the Vikings when they found Newfoundland. The first steps of white people, non-Indigenous people, Europeans into, I just prefer to say the white man, to be honest with you. The first steps of Europeans, non-Indigenous people into North America, they were still kind of transitioning, actually, even from swords to gunpowder, right? Like not every single person was packing black powder. There was still a lot of bows and arrows probably in the hinterland of their various countries, especially by peasants or yeomen who were hunting the king's deer, poaching them illegally. I happen to know a guy who's descended from those people. I'm looking at him right now. Anyways, good people. The point being that these things happened, and a people group like my own that had no horses, no wheels, no fabrics to speak of, nothing advanced in that respect, Stone Age tools and rudimentary agriculture, if you count the Mohawk and even the Mayan. Like, yes, they had plantations in the Mesoamerican area, but even there, and highly organized societies to a certain extent in the Mesoamerican area, that had decided that human sacrifice was a great way of moving forward. I think that we need to be honest about this and say, look, when the old world met the new world, there was a lot of tragedy. It was hard. Diseases spread because, of course, one group had the resistances, the other group did not. And cultures clashed, as they would have. Canada's experience with this was miles better than most other first contacts around the world. And what we need to be honest about when it comes to residential school system is, 250 years since the beginning of contact, and really more, almost like 300 years since the beginning of contact, we now had a problem. And the problem was, you couldn't have a Stone Age culture and an industrialized culture live side by side. That was nonsense. You couldn't do that. That couldn't happen. They couldn't live independently of one another. That can work in the Amazon, when literally the space age culture doesn't want to leave the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, because why would they? I mean, that's where everybody's wearing their beach wear, so it's hard to kind of leave. Hard to leave the beach. You get kind of distracted, and for that matter, that's where all of the industrialized life is. That's where all the if there is any manufacturing, that's where those jobs would be. So you go into the Amazon, the deep Amazon. Who wants to live there if you're from the space age technology people? You don't want to live there. There's nowhere to live. You'd have to build from scratch. And so the quote unquote, contactless tribes, or the Aboriginal groups in the deep Amazon, I mean, they're good to go. They're fine for another, who knows, maybe another 2 centuries. They're not going to have to change or adapt because, well, they don't deal with the people on the coast. But that's not how it happens in Canada. I mean, admittedly, the least kind of enculturated, that is to say, from non-Aboriginal culture inwards. So from European culture, Western culture inwards, probably the most non-culturated or non-mixed culture in Canada is, just like the remoteness of the Amazon, it's probably our Inuit population. The Inuit population has a semi-written language. There is a written language. I don't know how much of that is based on their own writing and how much of that has been done together in collaboration with the post-contact world, but there is a written language, and it's used for phonetic pronunciation. That I know, because when I was up in Churchill, Manitoba, living in the rectory, you can go down into the basement of the rectory, and there's a bindery there. They are translating things into Inuktitut. So Inuktitut is a written language, and people are doing it live. They're doing that in real time. The church is still helping with this. So speaking of the church being everywhere, including the places nobody wants to be because nobody can make any money at it. And the thing is that when it comes to the question of crossing cultures, just as like the point being the unadulterated, if you want to put it that way, Amazonian cultures, there's a similar thing that happens in northern Canada, where yes, the technology has changed. Now they ride bobsleds and not bobsleds. Well, that was silly. But they ride skidoos, though I'm sure there are some bobsleds up there too. They definitely have toboggans. They ride skidoos, and they still have dog teams around, but for the most part, people, of course, are on skidoo. They have rifles instead of harpoons, though they still use harpoons to pull narwhal and other things out of the water. But that is probably the most properly preserved or holistic culture that we have in Canada when it comes to Aboriginal people, is the Inuktitut. Sorry, that's their language, the Inuit, and singular is Inuk. Right. So I am an Inuk is how you would say that. I am an Inuk versus I am part of the Inuit, which is the people group. And that's because they were the last ones contacted. So they kind of got out of the bell curve, right? So instead of being pushed along the bell curve the whole way, they just kind of got taken at the end. And at the end, they kind of got most of the benefits of civilization without suffering as much of the tragedy. That's not to say there hasn't been. There is alcoholism, there is drug abuse, there are issues when it comes to family systems that have broken down. And yes, there were children seized. There's no question there were children seized off the land, out of communities. And so that's a difficult, terrible thing. But if you're looking for a kind of culture that is as preserved as it could be, considering the modern life, you're looking at the Inuit. Now, why do we need to dwell on this? I think we need to dwell on this for a couple of reasons, because when it comes to what happened in Kamloops, and when it comes to the Indian Act, and when it comes to this problem of contact, literally cultures that were thousands of years apart in development, if you're using a purely materialistic lens. Though even at a spiritual level, the only thing I'll say is this: I'm very thankful to be a part of a religion that has a final judgment. I don't want to be. I remember once somebody explaining to me some of the traditional beliefs inside of what would have been my culture, the Aboriginal culture, and this was a Western BC sort of thing. It was different. That's not the part of Canada I'm from when it comes to my Aboriginal heritage, but nonetheless, it seemed to be a pretty familiar idea. It was this idea that instead of there being a final judgment based on your actions, you just kind of wander around in a land of the dead. And I'm not really interested in that, because I don't really understand how you create a proper ethical framework from that. I'm not saying it's an inferior belief system necessarily. I'm just saying that I personally prefer the idea of there being a final trumpet sounding, and us all having to face our maker and give an account of what we've done. And the idea of, there not really being a right or a wrong to whether or not me or this guy, two warriors met in a field and one bashed the other's heads in, and the other guy lives another 20 years and this guy's gone. Who goes to heaven? Who goes to hell? Well, that's just not even a question. It's like, well, sorry, I don't know how I could subscribe to that. Like, that's not really me, man. But that's a different question altogether. Coming back to this point, though, of contact, you can't have a culture that has literally, gunpowder and steel versus, and a gun's germs and steel, if you want to use Jared Diamond's analogy, though I think Jared Diamond is like that author that nobody read, but everybody has his book. Sorry, Jared. Hope you're doing okay. I'm sure you're making lots of money off that book everyone keeps buying and not reading. But the point that I would like to make here is that you have one culture that's got guns, germs, and steel, and you got another culture that's using Stone Age tools. Those two cultures are not going to coexist in perfect harmony. How do you fix this problem? The solution that was come up by extremely progressive people for their time, let's be absolutely clear here, residential schools were a progressive policy prescription. The more conservative, the reactionary prescription was what the U.S. cavalry were doing to my direct ancestors, the Assiniboine and the Sioux, the American Sioux, Sitting Bull and all the gang. And given how many wives he had, I'm probably directly related to that guy. That was a system that was far more common. Okay, we're just going to go in there. We're going to use the sword, and we're going to just clear out the land. We're going to get rid of these people, get out of the way, put them on reserve land, huddle them on, and get out of the way. And that was more typical. That was far more typical. Well, we didn't do that in Canada. What we did was we took a different direction, and that other direction was, hey, let's try and civilize these people and assimilate them through the education system. That was a radical idea for its time. Incredibly progressive, incredibly forward thinking. And I mean all that in air quotes. I don't even mean them in sneer quotes. It's just, if you're going to use those monikers, that's what it was. So there we were at the end of the 19th century, trying to figure out how we were going to take people who were literally still living traditional means and bring them into civilization. I personally, if I could get a time machine, what I would have done, I don't know if I would have given Louis Riel the benefit of the doubt, because I think Louis Riel went a little bit sideways and got clearly carried away with his kind of obsessive messianic sort of self-image, and he was a polygamist too, for that matter. The point is that what I would say is that I would probably go back. I wouldn't maybe accept Louis Riel's interpretation of things, but I probably would have done what the Métis were trying to do in southern Manitoba. I would have tried to basically keep that model alive, which is to say that all Aboriginal peoples and the mixed race of peoples that was beginning to develop because of the interrelations between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals should essentially be given their stake in the country and put into a homesteading mode. And that way, slowly but surely, assimilation would have happened in a very kind of, to borrow from the Americans, Jeffersonian understanding of the homestead. So, I mean, you have to deal with your neighbors because you're living next to them. And you have to deal with the realities of new technology and everything else because you're farming and you're crop rotating and there's all sorts of crazy things going on. And that's what I would have done. So pretty straightforward. I would have tried to essentially have the two cultures. I mean, maybe that's a more French understanding, but just breed and become one culture and develop a single culture. So that's what I would have done. But of course, I wasn't in charge then. So unfortunately, the progressive mindset won the day, and that was a system of enclosure. We enclosed the Indians onto their land, onto very specific pieces of property, which usually weren't arable, usually weren't the greatest pieces of property, and that's not good. And then we help the children assimilate into being good citizens of Canada. And as a fundamental concept, that doesn't seem so wrong. But of course, the way that it got executed, and it's funny, like everything else in the Canadian government, they always give the most vital tasks to third parties. So they gave this task to the churches. I'm not saying it would have been any better being done by bureaucrats. It's just that it's funny because that's just how Canada is. It's like, well, we're kind of cheap, so we're going to outsource this problem to the churches. So they did that. And of course, we know what resulted. There were some instances of real good. There were some instances of banality and maybe neglect and just kind of in the general malaise of life. And then finally, there were, of course, intense abuses that could happen in certain places at certain times. And that's inexcusable. And the people, I again, if I was in charge, you better believe that as much as I might sound like an apologist in general, not just for the Roman Catholic Church, but also for the concept, at least the idea of residential schools, or at least the idea of there being an integration between the two cultures that was facilitated institutionally, if you want to use kind of long words like that to get around the point. if I was in charge now, you better believe that we would have capital punishment, and anybody and everybody who had been brought to trial and found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury of their peers for having committed these abuses in these places would, and even the ones who are already sentenced, they would be executed. There's no question. Absolutely none. They would be executed. You can't have those capital offenses allowed to continue. That's wrong, and you can't let people who committed those offenses get away with it. So again, with right evidence and right trials, that's what should happen. There's no question, and that goes for everywhere. I want to be very clear about that. It's not just about residential school abuse situations. It's about, you get a serial church abuser, someone within the church. That's the exact same thing that should happen there. Once it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the same thing that happens in any institution. RCMP officer doing it to subordinates. Military officers doing it to subordinates. It doesn't matter where you are. Abuse must be met with that level of deterrence. I absolutely believe that. So that was a bit of a trail. But let's get back on some of the news items we have here. Let's see. We've got a couple of things here. I'm trying to keep my producer from putting up the CBC one. Although I know we'll all get yelled at for that. But we're gonna do the Pride boycott. We'll start there. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. Technically speaking, June is Pride Month. I don't know who decides these things. That was declared at some point, I think actually under the Clinton administration, which I'm old enough to remember. And just barely. I don't know how they're keeping that guy alive. He's getting old. But here we are. And we've got, of course, the Pride boycott of Halifax Library, a disturbing attack on free expression. Now, we should give some credit where credit's due. That's Adam Zivo. I don't know who Adam Zivo is. I'm guessing that he's a part-time columnist for the National Post, given that's where this is posted. But let's just take a look. So last week, Halifax Pride boycotted Halifax Public Library over a refusal to pull a book from its shelves. The book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Schreier is considered by many to be transphobic and rife with misinformation. The boycott is part of a disturbing pattern of Canadian pride festivals penalizing library systems for defending freedom of expression. We're going to stop right there. You know what's a beautiful thing? I mean, the joke that many liberals used to make, especially during kind of the late austerity period of the early aughts, if you want to use aughts instead of the 2000s, is that, well, if conservatives had it their way, they would have banned libraries. Like, I mean, thank God we built those libraries when liberals were still in charge. A more liberal element of society was in charge of the political system. And it's like, okay, fun fact, it turns out that radical leftists, which is who that would be, not just because they're in a pride parade, but because there's genuinely radical leftists who are part of pride movements, are now protesting libraries. Like, you can't get more liberal than a library, right? Like in a pure freedom sense, right? Anything and everything, like technically speaking, even the most graphic book that's ever been published that's incredibly pornographic or whatever, it has an IBSN number and it is in the Library of Congress, right? Like it has been put into the great library of the Western world and all the great libraries of the Western world, right? So the most graphic, the most violent, the most vile thing, the Mein Kampf, the Communist Manifesto, it doesn't matter what it is. They're all in a library somewhere. And the rule about libraries is, just like embassies, there is a do not trespass rule. You're not allowed to attack an embassy because that's sovereign territory. And it's the idea is that if someone needs asylum, they can go to an embassy. And libraries are the embassies of knowledge. You don't get to trespass a library. You know why? Because whether you're right-wing or left-wing, whether you're rich or poor, the library will always stand. And if you are literate, or you take a course there to become more literate, you are capable of using this resource, which is literally the repository of all man's knowledge, all of mankind's knowledge for eternity, from beginning to end. Amen. That's the point of a library. And the joke is that somehow, some way, we have managed to get to a point where right-wingers, even right-wingers who might think that libraries are a waste of money, are defending, not that I actually do, I want to be clear, I don't, but I just mean in general, a kind of reactionary position. Well, they're spending another $10 million upgrading the library. Good God, what's that about? Admittedly, in Prince George, they did just upgrade the library, and it cost a lot of money because they built a set of stairs that was $10 gajillion. And I don't know who designed those stairs, but they need to, good for you, man, fleecing us for 10 whatever zillion dollars. The point is that that reactionary position, it's ironic that, somehow, some way, the only way you can make that reactionary suddenly a big pro-library advocate, go get a library card, join the board of directors of the library, is that you had a bunch of radical, crazy people waving the rainbow flag, which we all remember was actually supposed to be a sign that God wasn't going to flood the earth again, which is the reason why some of us have doubts about the climate changing a ton, is that, of course, the point is, you've managed to completely reverse the situation. So you could have radical leftists who were there defending the library. Instead, they are protesting the library, and they're just giving another boon to the right. Now, all of a sudden, the right is they're the library board. Apparently, the library board is right wing. Nobody would ever think of a librarian as a right wing person, for the most part. But there we are. We're there. We've gotten there. That's the world we live in. It's bizarre. We're going to keep going down this article here and see what else is going on. In 2019, we lost that. We need it back. Where are we going? There you go. In 2019, Megan Murphy, a writer frequently accused of transphobia, was invited to speak at a third-party event hosted at the Toronto Public Library in response. In response, Pride Toronto published an open letter melodramatically stating that there will be consequences to our relationship for this betrayal. I used that line on somebody the other way. This is the kind of thing people don't forget. They didn't like it. They really didn't like it, but hopefully they remember. Anyways, there will be consequences to our relationship for this betrayal. I should use that line. That same year, Vancouver Pride banned its local library system from the parade for allowing Murphy to book a space for that event. I'm just blown away here. It's kind of a joke. We'll scroll down just a little bit. I just saw the term gay days. Hold on. Scroll down. Actually, I guess I have a mouse. I can do this myself, can't I? I should learn how to do this. My producer wants me to learn how to produce better. Yeah. There we go. Look at that. I just scrolled. When LGBTQ folks were pariahs, condemned as evil and unnatural, it was freedom of expression that gave them a right to public existence, shielding them from state and social censorship. For example, when politicians wanted to exile gay days, an early form of public LGBTQ activism from Toronto's public parks, freedom of expression nullified that. When public officials misused pornography laws to outlaw early LGBTQ cultural publications, they failed on similar grounds. So that's the old way, right? So that's like the ACLU from another time, right? That's the Larry Flint ACLU. That's the civil libertarians of last generation. And that's how they fought their corner. They're like, look, you can't just mistreat somebody because they have a different sexual orientation than you. Let's be clear. I belong to a faith and hold the personal belief that this is a disordered passion and that it's not correct. That's my opinion. That's where I stand. I'm a social conservative, and that's where I stand on that issue when it comes to homosexuality and lesbianism, etc., let alone the transgender question. But that doesn't mean that inside of a democracy, a liberal democracy, a secular democracy with charter rights, that people whom I vehemently disagree with and do not believe are on the right side of this issue don't have a right to make their position heard. They do. They absolutely do. They have the right to congregate. They have the right to assemble. They have a right to speak and publish things. And they have a right to freely associate without fear of reprisal. That's completely correct. As long as they're not being terrorists about it, they can totally do whatever they want. Now, well, within the bounds of course, public reason as well, because there are obscenity laws for a reason. I can't sit naked on my front lawn. You can't walk naked down Main Street. That's fine. But the point is that it's just mind-boggling to me that they've decided to go the other way, which is now they didn't just want tolerance, they didn't just want things to go their way. Now they want supremacy. It's funny because it's always projection when it comes to the left, right? So they keep talking about white supremacy as if that's a real issue in Canada in any significant way. That's nonsense. Do white supremacists exist? Sure they do. They exist everywhere, I guess, but Does anybody think that some town or some part of this country is about to be seized by a bunch of white supremacists? Nobody does. Funny fact, though, we're in Pride Days, Pride Month, whatever, and the big parades are coming. And let me tell you that those streets will be seized by the people in charge of these events. And further to that, apparently, they are going to try and seize the means of production, the old Marxist cry. They're going to try and seize the means of knowledge. They're going to try and make sure that at the library, you can't have certain books. How does that make sense? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. Why would you do that? Why would you take away someone else's freedom of expression? That's a really bad idea. That's a really good way to incite someone to violence, actually, right? Because if I'm not allowed to speak, then the only way I have to express myself is violence. I mean, Jordan Peterson's been very clear on this point. That's someone we should try and get on the show. Do you think we could get Jordan Peterson on the show? I'm looking at my producer. And he's giving me a shrug. He's like, yeah, you're not big enough yet. Nobody cares what you think. All right, thank you. I couldn't possibly have said that, said my producer. All right. Love you too. But the point is, in so many words, look, I mean, I'd be the guy to try and say, I have gay friends. I actually don't. I think by distance, I have one gay acquaintance. Okay. Like I don't have gay friends. So I'm not even going to try and use that. I have so many gay friends. I have so many friends that are this race. That's why I make these jokes because I'm friends with that race. That's nonsense. I don't have any gay friends. But the point is that even if I did or didn't or whatever, I would hold the same opinion. And the opinion is you have the right to express yourself. I disagree with you because obviously my belief system completely disagrees with you, but that doesn't mean you don't have the right to exist. And you have the right to express yourself, obviously. So why is that not being afforded the other way? And besides, speaking of this question of transgenderism, we just had Chris Elston on this week. If you've been tuning into this show all week, you would know that, hey, transgenderism is a real issue and it's causing problems, especially amongst young women. And so the issue becomes very quickly, I've got something in my eye and I keep picking at it. I'm sorry, guys. There it is. It's gone. The point is that we have a right as a society to debate these questions openly and dispassionately. And that's the exact same thing that's wrong with the residential point that we were making earlier. You can't have a system. You can't have a system where nobody's allowed to talk about certain things, that certain things are taboo, right? And that's the great irony of what's happened on the left. If you go back to the left of the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, that left was trying to break down the barriers about what was taboo so that we could just live freely with expression and, I guess, and justice for all, whatever. The people could just express themselves. And then that would lead to a loss of oppression and people would just be better off. I, of course, would have demurred from that. I'm in many ways a 1960s conservative. I have a problem with radicalism. But the point is that nonetheless, that was the idea. But somehow, some way, especially once those people got in charge, and by those people, I mean anybody on the radical left who eventually kind of compromised, became bougie, moved to the suburbs, and essentially developed a kind of combination of left and right of center policies in order to just be bougie, right? Bougie suburb people. What happened was that they became in charge of the institutions and everything else, and they decided to seek supremacy. And as we've gone through with both Stuart Parker and Aaron Eckman, it's kind of an HR model. So the way that you discipline people is through browbeating and threatening their employment and group shame. And so instead of kind of a radical, like, hey, everybody should just kind of be able to do anything they want, whatever, it's become, no, everybody must follow these prescribed prescriptions. And then you're like, wait a minute, those are kind of like the taboos we had before, but worse, because before, at least we believed in like God and souls and hell and heaven and that sort of thing. And they're like, yeah, well, we don't believe in that stuff anymore, but we do believe that you have to subscribe to my belief system. Also, here's a bill for paying for it. It's called your taxes. Enjoy that very much. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And that's a problem. We're going to look at kind of the next thing here. UBC reviews award of honorary, what's this? The honorary degree that they gave to the bishop. Yeah, Bishop O'Grady. So here's a weird fact. So I'm broadcasting to you from BC's northern capital. That's Prince George. And we are, of course, right in the heart of the Prince George Diocese. And without getting into any kind of nitty-gritty details, the fact of the matter is that Bishop O'Grady still figures very large here in Prince George. And finally, we need to be clear that actually, when he founded Prince George College here in Prince George, which was a kind of residential school. It had residences, most of whom would have been Aboriginal students for sure. And they went to the high school here because there were no regional high schools throughout the rest of the Prince George diocese. They just built one high school in Prince George, lots of elementary schools, basically attached to every parish throughout the rest of northern BC. And they shipped the kids here after they completed elementary school in a more local spot. And there were, of course, other residential schools out west. In particular, Lejac comes to mind. There was a Lejac residential school out west, which is near Fraser Lake, and out west of Vanderhoof. Anyways, let's get on with this. So, the University of British Columbia is reviewing its awarding of an honorary degree to a Roman Catholic bishop who was once a principal at a residential school where the remains of over 200 children have been discovered. That's quite a punchy sentence. The university said Monday that it is aware of community concerns related to the degree conferred in 1986 to John O'Grady after specialists using ground-penetrating radar found grave shafts at the site of the former residential school in Kamloops. The discovery of the remains is deeply upsetting and being taken seriously by the university, which is located on the traditional unceded territories of 2 First Nations. Matthew Ramsey provided a statement issued. O'Grady died in 1998. Yeah, that's true. He did die in 1998. So I guess the short version of kind of what I would say here is that Bishop O'Grady belongs to, if you're kind of trying to get an idea of what Bishop O'Grady's status is here in northern BC, he really is kind of like the mini version of John Paul II for us, not in the same kind of polyglot sort of way and genius necessarily, but visionary. Bishop O'Grady was a visionary and became the bishop of this diocese a long time ago, and was bishop for a long time, and really brought Prince George's Catholic world from kind of its original milieu of the late 19th, early 20th century into the 21st century. Well, obviously he died before the 21st century, but bringing that spirit of conciliation, that spirit of community belonging, new evangelization. So he was a big deal. And this is hard. This is hard for people because there's people living today, plenty of people living today that know who Bishop O'Grady was and met him or grew up with him grew up knowing who he was and what he was doing and the respect he had in the community. So this is going to be hard, to put it politely, as people wrestle with it here in Prince George, because, well, Bishop O'Grady was a big deal. The high school, after he died, they renamed the high school after him, O'Grady High. So that doesn't run anymore. The Catholic school system in northern BC, all the elementary schools are still in existence, but the high school basically fell apart in the early 2000s, due to a combination of incompetence on the part of the church and a lack of support on the part of the community, combined together with just in general complete chaos around how to do this properly and just things falling apart. And they closed the school. And it has not reopened since. And now it is actually the diocesan office. And so the chancery, I guess you could call it. The point is that the old high school still bears his name and the residences still exist. Not all of them. Some of the residences became decrepit, so they had to be torn down. And they were basically glorified ATCO trailers. They're nice ATCO trailers, to be clear. They're kind of married together to mobile home width sort of things and about the right length. And they've got some kids in them right now. They've got some kids who are doing evangelization up here. Kids, they're all young adults, I guess. They're all just out of high school. But the point is that we're still using this property. Indeed, the show is being broadcast from there. I guess I can say that now that we're out of there. The show is being broadcast from diocesan property for a while. And for everything until this week. And I think that again, like, I guess you could say, so that's full disclosure. Like, I mean, I owe the, I couldn't have done this show to begin with without that. And now that we have this new space, we can kind of talk about that a little bit more. But the fact of the matter is that O'Grady High and the residences there that we were actually in, some of them, this was all happening for a long time. And we now have to kind of consider, I guess, for a moment, like, is there anything that needs to be thought about when it comes to the local high school and that sort of thing? If the high school reopens, will it be renamed? I don't know what's going to happen there. I don't think that Bishop O'Grady personally oversaw the neglect and death of children. I don't think that happened. And I think that would be a great mark against his legacy to accuse him of such things without black and white evidence that that's what happened. I think instead the way to think about it is that, like anything else, when you're the administrator or something, you kind of take your role, and hopefully you do it better, and hopefully you don't make those kinds of mistakes. But ultimately, I think that Bishop O'Grady, yes, his legacy is going to be tarnished by this, but I know that up here in Prince George, there's a lot of people who still have a deep amount of loyalty to them. So hopefully they're able to, we're able to live through that properly. But we'll find that reconciliation when we can. Stuart's supposed to be on with us shortly. I should actually check my messages because maybe Stuart has sent me something. I don't have anything right here right now. Do I have anything else? Oh boy, there we have him. He's just about here. He's just getting things sorted on his end. Oh, his camera's on. We're almost there. Ladies and gentlemen, our favorite resident leftist, Stuart Parker, is going to come and tell us everything we need to know about residential schools and what happened in Kamloops this week, and I'm sure other things on the news. And finally, as a final way of introduction, I think you said earlier this week, Stuart, on Facebook, that there were very few reasons you hadn't personally declared war on Canada. So I'm sure that the sovereigntists in the audience will be very happy to hear about why you're deciding to declare war on the Dominion of Canada.
Well, good morning. And I got to say, whoa, what happened there?
We got you. You're on.
Good. Okay, so, obviously, what happened in Kamloops it's a reminder of what Canada's about. And what we've seen coming out of the discovery of these graves is political opportunism, first and foremost, right? John Horgan is being hammered about his old growth logging policy. And so yesterday he got up at his press conference and said that, he has to keep logging the old growth. Otherwise, those children will have died in vain, right? That,
didn't.
Well, he did not say died in vain. What he said was that if we don't continue logging the old growth, then this is just going to be a continuation of the policy that killed all those children. And for their deaths to have meaning, then we've got to keep logging the old growth. And he gave these sort of contorted word salad reasons. Now, in the case of Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, they already had an event planned for next week. So they just brought up the timeline. They see spending another $2 billion investigating why Indigenous people are more likely to die, more likely to be poor, more likely to be murdered, etc. So this is, and so it's almost like you can see this barely disguised glee on the part of Canadian politicians of the left, that they can now just the most sort of superficial ways tie whatever it is that they want to do to somehow this being justice for these murdered children. And I mean, I've got to say the John Horgan thing. I mean, it's difficult to put together exactly what he said because there's a lot of word salad going on with John Horgan when he speaks in public, because word salad is how serial abusers talk, right? You throw a bunch of words out there and you associate a bunch of stuff, and this is what happens. So thank you, Aaron Eckman. Yes, I found it truly baffling that that he would, in a way, you've sort of got to. I mean, there's a curious way in which you've got to sort of admire the man. Like, who could brazen it out like that? They've screwed up some forestry policy on Vancouver Island. So a bunch of corpses of Aboriginal toddlers in Kamloops are now the reason their forestry policy on Vancouver Island is good. And I think and so some of what John Horgan did, it's the way that, I remember when the movie The Aristocrats came out, and I loved that movie, right? And it's a documentary about what had previously been an inside joke amongst professional comedians, right? Where somebody walks into an office to make a pitch to a theatrical agent, and they're asked to describe the act. And your job as a comedian is to talk for as long as possible and to include as many obscene, bizarre, and random acts in the act you're describing. And the punchline, at the end, you get to the punchline, and then the theatrical agent says, "And what do you call your act?" And the guy says, "We call it The Aristocrats." And I feel like that's become political speech in Canada now. That there's just there's a punchline the person's getting to, and it really doesn't matter what they say before the punchline. They're just throwing out crazy stuff because it's a foregone conclusion what they're going to say, which is, of course, the logging must continue, or the borrowing must continue, or the whatever it is must continue. And it's just filler up to that point. All they're doing is just a routine to kill time until they say the thing that everybody knows they're going to say before the joke even starts. And now, in the case of the Trudeau government, of course, this is a serendipitous thing for them. They were about to announce a pile of funding for Aboriginal justice and, reconciliation and blah, blah, blah. And a couple of things have happened. So first of all, they have an event to staple that to. And of course, Justin Trudeau ran for election on the basis of justice for Indigenous people in 2015. He ran for re-election on that basis in 2019. And let's be clear, he hasn't delivered nothing. He has delivered less than nothing, right? The government uses its resources to sue residential school survivors, right? That they fight them in court to try and prevent them from having to be compensated. This government approves new projects against the will of Indigenous people. So you've got a government that is escalating these policies, but at the same time, it has a voter base that at least superficially wants to claim to care deeply about the fate of Indigenous Canadians. And so there was going to be, so we've been watching Trudeau plan for this re-election bid. It was the hate crimes legislation. It was the conversion therapy legislation. It was going to be more studies and more consultation with Indigenous people. So, right, there's a whole Indigenous consultation industry where there's a group of people who get out there and they go to reserves, they meet Aboriginal people in the cities, and they put up the big whiteboard and they listen to people's stories and they cry and they write things on the whiteboard. And, and then the thing ends and they erase the whiteboard, because this consultation industry, its purpose is not merely to do nothing. It is to waste the time of people who would otherwise be doing something more effective to communicate with the government. They would be occupying an MP's office. They would be organizing a third-party strategic voting campaign to defeat that MP. They'd be protesting. They'd be, removing a section of a pipeline in the middle of the night, removing a siding from some rail. There's so much anger. And the idea is, if we could just absorb all productive political organizing into our consultation process, it's crazy. And of course, I became familiar with this as an environmentalist in my teens, right? We had a name for this process. It's called talk and log. So the thing is to keep people talking in a room over there while you're doing the thing you want to do out there on the land over here. And so consultation is not merely useless. It is a targeted way of spending money to divert people's attention and to make all these people who aren't paid to be at these consultation tables use their paid time, use their holiday time, use whatever, soak up as much time as you possibly can. So Trudeau had been preparing to spend about $600 million asking Indigenous people the same questions everybody has asked them since about 1982. And just ask the questions again until somebody passes out, I guess. That's the plan. And then we write things on the boards and we eat the pinwheel finger sandwiches and we go home. And it's so extraordinarily disrespectful at this point, I would argue, to engage in these kinds of open-ended processes. There are people who've been trying to tell the federal government very simple things about what their community needs for more than a generation. And to show up in their community and ask them again, say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." To do that to people who have a real problem every other year for 30 years is grotesque, right? If you do that at a bar, you can do that maybe 4 times in a row before someone punches you. And that's what the Trudeau government had planned. And one of the things that these graves have done is they've struck fear into the heart of what I would call culturally liberal Canadians. Now, I had never actually met a real live liberal until I moved to Ontario. I had met a lot of people who voted for the Liberal Party of Canada strategically or to fit in or whatever it was that they needed to do. But even Liberal MPs, I'd never met a real liberal. And when I moved to Ontario, it was deeply culturally disorienting to be around actual liberals, because say what you will, folks in the West generally mean what they say and say what they mean, right? When Stephen Harper didn't support the Kyoto Treaty, he denounced the Kyoto Treaty and proceeded to pull out of it, right? Like that's what a Westerner would do. But you see, rank and file liberal people living out east, they want 2 things. They want to be thought of as people who are concerned and compassionate and and woke to the various things that one must need to be woke about. But what they also want is a growing economy, a stable investment portfolio, and they actually don't want all these inconveniences of like having to spend their money getting potable water onto a reserve or having to not do a project because the project would blow past the Kyoto targets. So we think in the West that like the Liberal Party making these announcements and then doing less than nothing about that, we think that's a bug. We think that undermines their credibility. But for millions of people in Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes, that's a feature. The fact that you know that a Liberal prime minister will cry on TV and then accelerate whatever it is that he's crying about, right? The fact is that our carbon emissions have grown faster every year under Justin Trudeau than they did under Stephen Harper. Much as Stephen Harper articulated that he was skeptical of climate science, that he wanted to build the Canadian fossil fuel sector, blah, 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 his need to tell the truth got in the way. His need to be transparent about what he believed in made people out east very uncomfortable. It was like, why? Look, we could blow past these carbon targets. We could seize more Indigenous land. We could engage in more austerity policies if you would just claim that you're doing the opposite. Why can't you describe the world we all want to pretend we want to live in, that we just don't want to pay for or make any sacrifices for? And of course, Justin Trudeau is just the spokesmodel for that. That's his only job, is for the next time there's somebody's taken on a midnight ride by the Saskatoon cops, the next time, an Indigenous woman goes missing on Highway 16, the next time that happens, what Justin Trudeau can do is he can literally dissolve demands for change in his tears. That's the power of the Trudeau tears. And so we've really seen some sort of disgusting tear laundering this week. Now, the other thing that you'll notice, though, is that people who are mad about that have also been pulled into this discourse where the conversation has become shockingly associated with like flags and statues. It's like, well, look at all this murder. I guess we should relocate another John May Macdonald statue because that's going to help. Oh my God, look at all of these dead kids. How many flags should we fly at half-mast? How many flags should we take down? Should we put up different flags later? And this becomes the conversation. So one of the things that you can really see here is that this cultural liberalism of the East, it's diffusing through the whole country through this sort of social media wokeness, that we're going to parse the words and apologies, and we're going to, like, and somebody said, I said, there was this question of, why hasn't a national day of mourning been called? It's like, well, what? How does that do anything? It's just more distraction. And so it's like, and so somebody said to me, well, at least an apology would be a start. I went, a start? We've been doing nothing but apologizing since 1982. What the heck has started with an apology? We know what the apologies are for. They're to distract us. They're to slow things down. So they said, well, what could we actually do? I go, well, you could connect every reserve in the country to hydro. You could have public transit service on reserves. You could actually install the drinking water systems you were elected to install 6 years ago. There's a long list, right? You could require that industrial employers not be able to run for more than 3 months unless their employees are in permanent residences, right? Because the number one killer of Indigenous women and girls in this country are work camps. Now, I'm not saying that the camps make serial killers. I'm saying the camps are serial killers. That what they do is they, like, much as people say, well, rape isn't really about sex, it's about power. It's like, well, that's true for the person being raped. But the thing is that most violence against Indigenous women by folks like us, by colonists or by those of us passing as colonists or what have you, is opportunistic, right? It's opportunistic. It's simply that you isolate a bunch of young men on a rig somewhere. Their only neighbors are reserves. They're the only ones with vehicles that are going through the reserves, and they're being fed on crystal meth. What do you think's going to happen? And so instead, what we're doing is we're expanding the work camp system, which is why the number of murdered and missing women on Highway 16 keeps going up instead of going down while we make all these announcements. And that's the problem, though. What people will say is like, well, maybe we should like educate men to like respect Indigenous culture more. It's like, well, we know what that does in the context of sexual abuse in a church. It just makes rapists idealize the person they're raping. It doesn't stop the crime. It just changes how it's being mentally categorized. And so there are all of these threats that Indigenous people face in this country that are especially targeted at them by how we've set up the social order, mainly by denying Indigenous communities basic infrastructure we give every other community and pushing people into dangerous situations just in order to go to the darn medical clinic because they have a toothache. And it's not that nobody's going to do anything about that. It's that we want to build more of these camps. We want to have more young men isolated in all male communities being fed stimulants because that makes money. And the reason that these Ontarians will show up and vote for Justin Trudeau, and the reason an increasing number of Vancouverites will follow suit, is because they want to be able to claim, I really thought he'd do something when we find the next pile of bodies. They want to be able to claim to have been fooled. But I don't know how somebody can get up in the morning and claim to have been fooled by these transparent lies, by these obvious crocodile tears. The only people who could possibly be fooled are people with a desperate emotional need to claim that they've been fooled so that they can say, well, I asked this guy to take care of this major Canadian problem for me, and he didn't. I feel so betrayed. I feel so terribly betrayed by Justin. I guess we're going to have to find a new crying pretty boy in a few years.
I mean, that was one hell of an opener, Stuart. And I think that was very good and very on point along the way. I think that maybe to your point of needing the feeling of needing to feel betrayed. I think that it goes back to something you said not so long ago, again on your feed there, of you can wake someone who's sleeping, difficult as might be. It's impossible to wake someone who is pretending to be asleep. And I think that's very much the Canadian mentality with a lot of things. It's a lot of sanctimony, and nobody seems to understand that, you know what, like Canada, is it the worst place on earth? I don't know about that, but it definitely has a very high opinion of itself for some very lowbrow things that it gets up to.
Well, we have this good fortune, right, where it's in the interest of Canadian liberals, American liberals, and Europeans to pretend that Canada is the country that Justin Trudeau describes it as being, because that gets things done for people in other countries. For American liberals, they get to say, like, why can't, look, we could just be like the paradise up north, right? Where nobody goes bankrupt because they get cancer, which of course is false, right? There's lots of chemo bankruptcy in this country. If you're a chemo day patient, you could be paying as much as $36,000 a month to stay alive. So, but American liberals get to campaign for healthcare. They get to campaign for, climate justice. They get to campaign for all that stuff by going, why can't we be like this fake Canada this guy is describing? And Europeans can just say, look at how terrible America is. it could be just like Canada. They're right next to each other, and yet it's not. So creating a fake Canada to compare America to is such an easy rhetorical tactic for criticizing Americans. It doesn't really get you into that much trouble unless, you're in Latin America and there's a Canadian mining company in your town, in which case, you're hiding women in cellars so that the rape gang hired by the Canadian mining company doesn't come after them. So that's the other thing. There are all kinds of industries in Canada that shelter their bad behavior on the international scene by saying, "Oh, but we're Canadian." I'll tell you, if you poll people, and actually polls have been done, you poll people in New Guinea, you poll people in Bolivia, you poll people in Guatemala, what's scarier, the American Army coming to your town or Canadian mining company? It's the Canadian mining company. But this works for so many people, this fake story we're telling. And if you live in a certain kind of bubble, you should never be, you can avoid any physical contact with that lie. You probably know it's a lie in your heart, but you can push that out of your reality most of the day. And folks who, live out here in the resource periphery, we don't have that opportunity, right? We've got to make a choice about how to interpret what it is that we see, how to talk about what it is that we see. So, yeah, I think there's a reckoning. I'm also noticing, of course, there's, so as we're saber rattling over the federal election and, these Indigenous children's corpses are being conscripted into the army of Justin Trudeau, we see that, Tories are being sort of back-footed onto their standard issue, which is the debt. And the borrowing debate is a really important debate that Canadians need to have. But again, the problem is that it's in too many people's interest to dishonestly debate what risks Chrystia Freeland is setting us up for by pushing our debt over our annual GDP, right? That's a real thing that folks should worry about. But far more sinister than what we see with the amount of the debt, it's the rate at which it's being borrowed and how the government is borrowing it. We have this thing called the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which basically takes the worst thing about a public-private partnership and generalizes it. So public-private partnerships are generally idiotic as a way of getting things done. What you do is the government hires a private company to do a thing the government should be doing directly. And they go, but look, the private company, they won't be bound by our fair wage policy. They can pay their employees less, right? They have all kinds of flexibility that the government wouldn't have if it directly did the job. But the reason that P3s are popular and the reason Justin Trudeau and his crew go bananas for them is because when money has to be borrowed for those projects, it's the company going to the bank, not the government, which means the company is paying maybe 6 times the interest rate on the money that the government would for a large loan. So what you're effectively doing with P3s is you're vastly increasing the interest rate for all of your borrowing, and you're creating worse and worse terms for your borrowing by borrowing indirectly through companies. And it's scary to be in a P3, even if you're like a company. I used to have no sympathy for companies that would work with governments in a P3, but it's terrifying doing all that borrowing, knowing that it's only the government following through on its end of the deal that's going to allow you to get paid at the end of the day. So we created, I mean, the last, the thing that, what's his name, Bill Morneau, his big legacy that he's left Chrysler Freeland with is the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which is the guarantee that when the feds build a road, or God forbid, they actually build one of those water treatment systems on a reserve, I'm not holding my breath, that the borrowing for that is not done through the conventional Ministry of Finance channels. And so it means that the government has, that we end up with far more crippling interest payments. And over the course of a project, we'll just pointlessly overpay for it. Well, it seems like it's the same amount of money or less on the balance sheet.
That's deeply upsetting. Obviously, the Conservatives are going to have to figure out how to articulate that to the Canadian people in such a way that they can digest it. Otherwise, and I think they've already tied their hands behind their back when it comes to cultural war issues, because outside of talking about Facebook suddenly becoming the puppet of the Liberal Party, which seems to be happening through the legislation that's coming, all social media suddenly being used as a tool by the Liberal Party and their apparatchik, on top of the hate speech legislation, on top of the questions of transitions and detransitioning. It seems like the Conservatives have given away the farm and the driveway and the truck, and now they're just walking along the road, lost in the political wilderness.
Well, this is what I found so strange about Aaron O'Toole. Like, the right is clearly winning the culture war. Otherwise, I and so many of my friends wouldn't be siding with the right in the culture war. It's absurd. Like, finally, the sort of liberal side of the culture war it got too cocky, it went too crazy, and it lost all these people like me, all these lifelong socialists. And at the very moment where we're like, yes, you know what? I mean, my friend Liesel put it really well. She said, I said, like, how do you, like, you used to work for the NDP too. How do you handle how it's all gone? She goes, Stuart, it's like every single bad, slippery slope argument the right made in the 80s turned out to be true. Like, that's the reality that we're living in. Every argument we dismissed as like intellectually unsophisticated and unsupported by evidence, it actually is coming true. We can't believe it. It's really quite embarrassing. And at that very moment where the majority of Canadians are actually on side with Conservatives on culture for the first time since like 1962, that's the moment where the Conservatives go, we concede.
Yeah.
And that is a very strange moment. Because I think that if Justin Trudeau were to, choose to run the Liberals clearly have noticed that their culture war positions are not going to get them through the election. That's why they have to have $2 billion on new Indigenous reconciliation spending. That's why they're out there promising people childcare. They're not doing those things, just because. They're doing those things because they think that if they go with nothing but the hate speech legislation, the internet regulation legislation, the conversion therapy legislation, they're going to be slaughtered. And so I was very impressed with Aaron O'Toole when he got that job initially. I felt that he was really smart in talking about private sector trade unions and how folks who aren't government employees but are union members are really at sea. But the problem is he didn't put anything materially on the table for those folks. He tried to frame things in solely cultural terms. And right now, if you want to turn the tide on the deunionization of the private sector, you actually need to hand people tools that they can use in their community to build union locals, and to connect those locals to others without becoming dependent on big international U.S.-based unions. You look at something like the Steelworkers Union, and there you'd think, well, this is great. Steelworkers, they've done phenomenal work. They were crucial in exposing a lot of China's crimes in Western China, what's going on in Xinjiang and with the Uyghur people, all that. But the problem is, when it comes to local fights, they have no dog in those fights. John Horgan spent 3 years in office going, I'm sorry, we can't bring back card certification for unions because the Greens won't let us. He gets into power with the support of the steelworkers, and guess what? Still no card certification. There's a very basic institutional switch. And so you get Brad West, who's the mayor of Port Coquitlam, who receives more per month from the Steelworkers Union as their guy than he does as mayor. So imagine how well he advocates for the people of Port Coquitlam if they're not even signing his largest check. What's Brad West doing about that? Not a whole heck of a lot, right? There are all kinds of struggles that, working folks have in creating some kind of justice at their workplace and greater stability. Well done, guys. You've delivered the worst possible cable system to Canadians, and yet there wasn't that attempt. O'Toole just made that one speech about private sector unions, and then he just wandered along like, oh, maybe I'll try this next thing and see if it works.
Off he goes. One thing I would like you to help us understand, Stuart, is the historical side of the residential school question. I remember you wrote something that got into the Georgia Strait at one point, and you highlighted to your own side very clearly that if they wanted to kind of paint this as some right-wing conspiracy theory against Indigenous people, they were not going to have a good time. The history did not bear that out.
Well, right. So let's be clear. When the residential school system was set up, there was an overwhelming consensus. It didn't come out of nowhere. Interestingly, the demands for the residential school system came out of Indigenous people's movements. So this was originally a demand by Indigenous leaders in Canada, because the greatest Indigenous leader of the mid-19th century was this guy Benito Juarez, first Indigenous person elected to the highest office in a country in the Western Hemisphere. He became the president of Mexico after becoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Mexico. And Benito Juarez lived in a country where education took place on reserve, it was run by churches, and it was done in the Indigenous language in question. So the Roman Catholic Church had translated their catechism into all of these different Indigenous languages. And if you learn to read in that language, the only things you could read would be things by the church. And Juarez is like, I was trapped inside this language in my village. I couldn't appear in court. I couldn't start a business. I couldn't exercise my political rights. So I believe that we need to break the power of this system and start educating our people in the national language so that we can compete in the courts, so that we can compete in the corporate sector. And he had tremendous faith in Indigenous people's ability to do that. Now, in America, there's another reason that the residential schools were called for. And that was that it wasn't just that you couldn't staff an Indigenous day school. You couldn't staff settler day schools in many communities because there was a huge teacher shortage. And so you had a situation where all kinds of on-reserve schools had no teacher in them. So initially, there was this demand of the government to create this system. Now, of course, there are other agendas that existed in that government to do with the getting rid of Indigenous culture, getting rid of Indigenous languages, blah, blah, blah. So they always could find those quotes from MacDonald and his ministers talking about culturally exterminating Indigenous people. But we have to remember that though that wasn't the only view that was being expressed in Parliament, all four of the major parties in Parliament, when we created this system, supported the schools, but for different reasons. The Parti Rouge supported them for the same reason that Benito Juarez supported them. They believed that it was going to give Indigenous kids a fairer shake at succeeding in a colonial society. Now, of course, within a generation, it became pretty obvious that those schools weren't doing that. That instead they were returning traumatized people to reserves, not educated people to reserves, when they returned them at all. So the problems with that system were clearly evident. But right, we're Canadians. We don't talk about what a system does, we talk about what it should have done. So as long as you could keep encoding these lofty principles in the system, everybody benefited from them. The churches benefited from them with huge government funding that allowed them to do what they wanted to do. And so the churches were on board, and whatever it was and so when the government changed hands and Sir Wilfrid Laurier got in, the system got bigger. They made it bigger. They made it more powerful. And many people still believed, and this is really like ground zero of that Canadian belief that do-gooders, that if you just have good intentions and you go out there, things will work out. And of course, that's one of the things that actually causes people to not check their behavior. Right? If somebody thinks, wow, look at what great sacrifices I'm making. Look at what a wonderful person I am. I'm a member of the caring professions. I'm out there helping people. That often allows people to expand their blind spot about the harm they're causing. And that's why when they had to deal the Progressive Party into government in 1921, the residential school system got bigger again, right? And we have to remember that the parties that stood behind the residential school system, the CCF, the NDP, the Liberals, the Tories, the Progressives, the Parti Bleu, the Parti Rouge, all the way back, it arose out of what we would term an elite consensus, a national elite consensus, where you could support the schools for opposite reasons for the person next to you supporting the schools. So one group of people wants to smash Indigenous culture, and that's their story about themselves. Another group of people wants to save Indigenous culture by translating it into this new language. They can tell that story about themselves. And the residential schools permitted all of these different elite factions to say, no, the schools are for this thing. The schools are for that thing. And the problem is that we're abducting more Indigenous kids per year than we did at any time during the residential school system. But what we say is, oh, our ancestors were black-hatted villains. We, on the other hand, are good, compassionate people. And because we're good, compassionate people, we know that our intentions are going to produce good. So whereas my bad grandfather was part of a system of evil people who went into the homes of Indigenous families and stole their children at night, I am part of a good system that goes into the homes of Indigenous people and steals their children in the middle of the night. And my good intentions are going to translate into better outcomes. So the other thing is that, sure, the residential school building is dead. The churches delivering education is dead. But what remains is the system of systematic abduction and trauma by the caring professions. And as long as people go, oh no, only bad people wanted the residential schools, only bad people thought this was a good idea, then it allows people to not examine the complexity of their own motives or the effects of their actions, irrespective of their motives. So, ancestor blaming is also, of course, part of this larger Canadian project of laundering the deaths of Indigenous people in the tears of our leaders. And that process started very early in the residential school system. The idea that we never criticized those things, never looked at them, that we weren't presented with evidence until decades later, it doesn't hold up on the historical record. But we cherry pick from the historical record. We only quote people who said mean things about Indigenous people when we look at the history of the system. But those quotes are vastly outnumbered by quotes about saving Indigenous children. You got to remember that when this system was put together, this was in the age of Charles Dickens. And what did people think was the greatest evil in the age of Charles Dickens? They thought it was child labor. And so you can imagine, like, all of these, like, good, caring folks from the Women's Auxiliary at the Presbyterian Church reading these Charles Dickens stories. And then, if you went out, you could actually go out into the country and see Indigenous kids working fishing weirs or Indigenous kids helping to plow fields. And it was really easy for them to make that connection, like, oh, these children should be saved, just like Oliver Twist.
And so we put them into residential schools.
Yeah, that appears to have been the plan. But again, they could legitimately go back and say this was something that was demanded. And that's one of the other sad things. It's like previous generations of Indigenous leaders aren't allowed to have made mistakes, aren't allowed to have guessed wrong about what was going to help. There are all these early generations of Indigenous leaders who deserve our admiration. No one could have guessed how horrible this was going to be. The idea of the fact that this was all guessed from the beginning, I think, is it suggests that we were a nation of sociopaths, when in fact we're just kind of a nation of assholes. Like we don't rise to the level of total programmatic sociopathy. We're just people who like to look away from the consequences of our actions when we can do so.
As we kind of round out the hour here, Stuart, what then are we looking at when it comes to the future of Aboriginal peoples in Canada? As a status Indian myself, it's one of the things that I always kind of wrestle with. Obviously, I wasn't raised in the trauma. I wasn't, and I fully acknowledge that. At the same time, when I hear news like this, I definitely grieve and I definitely mourn in some semblance of solidarity. I don't think they're crocodile tears on my part. I understand that they don't feel maybe the same way that they would for somebody who was right there. And I feel like so much of the problem, a lot of it's tied up in the Indian Act, which is either needs to be discarded or it's unfinished. You've talked about land reform before. There's a question of empowerment. We're here on Sovereigntist TV, as you like to call it. We're here at the Western Standard, and there's this debate about whether or not Canada should even remain what it is. I don't know which way to pick up that stick. There's a lot of pieces to that, and where does that have to go from there?
Well, I think this goes back to the thing that I said about all this that appears to have got the most traction. So I'm doing some work with Carriers to Canny Family Services on the Highway of Tears question, right? That we're in 2006, right? We'd been calling Highway 16 the Highway of Tears for 8 years by that point, and we counted up to about 40 murders. And there was a symposium held in Terrace. Indigenous people from up and down the highway got together, and they said, yes, we're going to mourn, but this is going to be a call to action. We got a list of things that are going to make a difference. And they aren't like blue sky, like here's how to imagine indigeneity, here's how to reimagine Canada, here's how to reimagine status. It wasn't stuff like that. It was, we need more flag stops on the bus route here, here, and here. We need a milk run bus that goes on and off reserve here, here, and here. We need cell towers, extra cell towers built here, here, and here. And so that's why in the past 15 years, we've asked them what they need every 2 years, because we don't want to just do what's on the damn list. I think that we will feel our way towards a reconciliation if we actually decide to stop doing big things, big meta level things, and just do the damn small things we know would work, right? Skookumchuck on the Lillooet River between Pemberton and Harrison Hot Springs. That reserve has been there, since the 1850s. And no one, and BC Hydro and the BC government simply refused to put a transformer station there so that the high tension power lines that go right over the houses of all the people on reserve could power those houses. Instead, the people on the reserve had to get a diesel generator. And then eventually they paid my ex-father-in-law to come in and design some micro hydro for them. So they're literally on the main line that transmits power from the huge reservoirs up north to Vancouver. But no one could string a power line for them, and no one has strung a power line for them in the 100 years those power cables have been there. That's the thing. You know what? Maybe we can get to reimagining the Indian Act. Maybe we can get to doing those things. But if we could just do the incredibly, incredibly simple things. Everybody knows it's better to have a house with power in the outlets. Everybody knows it's better to have a house with clean, chlorinated drinking water coming out of the taps. Those things are so indescribably basic. They are so damn simple. It's like, well, what is the cure for the Indigenous homeless population? The Indigenous people are so disproportionately homeless. Well, it's because of a lot of cultural trauma. It's because of damage to the epigenome through generations of abuse. Yeah, that's all true. But you know what really keeps people homeless is not having a house. So what if we adopted Finland's policy of housing first? Hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put you in a house, and then we're going to work on your mental illness. We're going to put you in a house and then find you a job. Do you know anybody whose mental illness is successfully resolved while they were living under a tarpaulin? Anybody who's got it together and gone back to school while they're bunking out under a tarpaulin in a municipal park? I don't think so. Pretty hard to kick a habit when you're living in conditions under which no human being should live. So there are these just incredibly simple material things. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about law and culture and this other stuff, and I used to really lead with that in debates. But you want to stop people hitchhiking, give them a bus. You want people to have housing, give them a house. It's so simple. The first things we have to do are so simple, and we haven't gotten around to them in 150 years.
No, that's pretty damning. Very damning. That's something I've always wondered about the nature of what those next steps are, is that maybe that was where those protests came from in the 1960s against Trudeau Sr.'s attempt to wipe out the Indian Act with the white paper when he was justice minister in Pearson's government. And the point, of course, being that they felt that there was unfinished business. And I must admit that whatever my differences are between me and my fellow Aboriginal, especially those who agitate against the colonists in a particular way, where I am perhaps more sympathetic, I do agree that there's unfinished business, and that needs to be resolved. And until there is, there will be no peace.
Yeah, and it's really, I think that, I had this epiphany when I was watching Justin Trudeau's blackface performances, right? Because Trudeau's my age. He was living in my city. He was working for my friends when this was going on. And when you see Trudeau doing that, it's of a piece with his other antics when he was just like a trust fund kid with no job. And what they were about is a certain form of, like, for Trudeau, I think insulting Black people was secondary. The main reason he was doing these performances was because he had this weird humiliation fetish, right? That he liked humiliating himself in public. He liked being scolded in public. And what I see with so many folks is that one of the reasons we amplify the voices of Indigenous people who blame colonists most effectively, most articulately, is because that's actually what a group of colonists want to hear. It's like, what's her name's, Whoopi Goldberg's role on Star Trek: The Next Generation. The idea of being scolded by a person of color is like actually part of the liberal experience. Like, the being scolded is part of the package of things they enjoy about being a liberal. They like to be say, oh, this person really articulately scolded us, and I'm such an evolved person that, I could really appreciate that and take that in. But that is totally part of the stage play we're putting on as well. You want to put up the most effective scolders, but those are not always the most effective people in describing the types of reform that are required. So I think we have to remember that like there's a group of us out there. There's a group of white liberal colonists who enjoy the scolding, and the scolding is a feature. It's just like the land acknowledgements, right? They're the Canadian version of American Thanksgiving. You get up, there are no Indigenous people in the room, and then you apologize to the people who aren't there, and then you welcome yourself to the room on their behalf. And so you've done the whole thing, and you're just like narrating a set of thoughts in your head. And then the other white liberals are there, and it's like, hey, look at how evolved that guy was. There was like the crying, and he pronounced all the names with the apostrophes in them, with the clicking sounds. Like, this is a pitch perfect performance.
There. Oh my God. Stuart, you're a gem. That was amazing. So bang on. Like it's not even satire or farce. It's like it's a reading of facts.
We really live in the post-satiric age. There's nothing left to satirize. And we're going to go into we're almost certainly, O'Toole's coming up in the polls through no fault of his own. But I'm guessing that with the big Indigenous funding announcement, Trudeau will get that poll bounce, and we'll go into our summer COVID election. And and we're going to watch this absurd pageant play out on the national stage again. And yet, while all that is going on, there is going to be an Indigenous woman in Fort St. John or in Kitwanga who's going to disappear during that 6-week campaign. I've been reading the stats. We're at like a 4 to 5 per year rate just in the western part. We have about the same rate of disappearance in the Peace Country, but it's different. It's not from the highway. And so while we play out this ridiculous pageantry of our guilt and our liberalism, people will die, and their deaths will just be fodder for the next liberal election campaign. And that's the other thing. If this goes away, the ability of liberals to narrate who they are is undermined. And so, and the consultation industry is undermined. There's a whole system here that is helping people build their identities, helping people get and keep their jobs, and very few of those people are Indigenous. So my hope is that, I mean, I'm just going to have to look away from the election. I don't think anything good is going to happen there. But my hope is that a few more people can no longer suspend disbelief, can no longer think that this is the first apology. Like, we have done our first apology more times than we've discovered climate change as a new form of science. Like, there are some things that get discovered every 2 years, and they're brand new every 2 years. And eventually that has got to break through into more people's consciousness. That, is this deja vu? No, this is not deja vu. This is just us reenacting the same nonsense.
And so we must resolve to have a permanent change and a practical one. I completely agree. Stuart, thank you so much for coming on today. We, of course, love having you here on Thursdays to kind of help us round out the week and understand things in that in-depth level. Really appreciate your thoughts today on what happened in Kamloops and the Indian residential school question generally.
All right. Thanks, Nathan. Always glad to be here. See you next week.
See you next week, Stuart. Well, we're at the end of our hour here, the end of our 2 hours, to be clear. I guess if we have just a moment, I guess I could try and produce myself for 2 minutes here. Let's see if I can put up, let's see, do I have the ticker? Resistance Coffee. Hey, I do. Okay, so there's the Resistance Coffee code, promo code. I'm going to read this script again, and I'm going to put up my, do I have my, yep, and I have my email as well. So don't forget to email us with anything on the show that you'd like to comment on, or any suggested guests that you have, or topics that you'd like explored. We're into our new space now, so we're able to kind of take questions, comments, concerns, and process them a little better, and get some more guests on here and do just a little bit more with the show. We're excited to get on with it and to do more. We're in week 9, end of week 9 right now, and we're very excited to be here. But let me just read this out again for our Resistance Coffee Company endorsement. Are you tired of having woke political correctness rammed down your throat everywhere you turn? Are you frustrated by businesses you support giving money to woke causes? Resistance Coffee Company is here for you. Now you can enjoy the wonderful taste of fresh roasted coffee with the knowledge that your money isn't funding woke causes. In fact, Resistance Coffee goes 10% of every purchase to organizations that are fighting for the constitutional freedoms of Canadians. Visit resistancecoffee.com. That's resistancecoffee.com, and use promo code Western Standard for 10% off your first order. So that's where we're going to end our broadcast. Again, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Next week, we're going to start off, I believe, with John C. Thompson. I'm going to double check on that. And then, of course, we're going to have the guy from the Wild Rose, the Independence Party, I believe. He's coming on. So just stay tuned for next week. We're going to break out the week with Aaron and Stuart again, do our news roundup. But thank you so much. You have a great start to your summer. I hope you've been released from your COVID restrictions and you can get out of there. So we'll see you next Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. I'm Nathan Giede, and this was Mountain Standard Time.